There are many main ingredients for a great rivalry: competitive spirit, talent, geographical location, toxic fan bases, and a well-established history. And well, the rivalry between Michigan and Ohio State fits all those ingredients and more. So naturally, we need to go way back to see how this rivalry became the prototypical rivalry of North American sports and became known as the game.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
As mentioned, a great rivalry needs history, and it'd be very hard to find a rivalry that goes back further than this one. Yes, the first football game was played in 1897, but the hostility between these two can be traced 100 years prior for events that have nothing to do with football. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was enacted by the Congress of the Confederation that planned out ways to settle the Great Lakes area, and established that the border between Ohio and Michigan would be an east and west line drawn through the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan until it intersected with Lake Erie. But like many land conflicts, disputes arose after poor mapping. The maps that were used by Congress inaccurately placed Michigan's southern tip miles north of its location, and the original border gave Ohio the future Toledo location. Though if drawn accurately, Michigan would have received the same area. Ohio was admitted to the Union in 1803, and in their state constitution, they defended their claim on the land based on the original ordinance. But Michigan challenged this, and two different land surveys conducted came to different conclusions, resulting in a 468 square mile property on the border that became known as the Toledo Strip, that was to be occupied by both Michigan and Ohio, meaning no way this could end bad. And this land became important because the Toledo Strip gave access to a great deal of trade, and with the creation of the Erie Canal in 1825, it became even more important. Over the next decade, Michigan worked to settle the region by laying roads, holding elections, and collecting taxes. And with Michigan still being a territory in the early 1830s, Ohio used their congressional power to block Michigan's petition to join the Union in exchange for surrendering the Strip. And that's when things started to get heated. Michigan's 24-year-old governor, Stephen T. Mason, instituted penalties for residents submitting to the other's authority, and both Michigan and Ohio deployed militias on opposite sides of the Maumee River, giving March 31, 1835, the start date of the Toledo War. And ultimately, it's best to put quotations over the war, because aside from the taunting, arrest, and reports of gunfire, only one person was wounded, and that was Deputy Sheriff Joseph Wood, who was non-fatally stabbed when Major Benjamin Stickney resisted arrest in Toledo. But this so-called war that resulted in one person being wounded came to an end at the end of 1836, when President Andrew Jackson called for a compromise. He told Michigan that they would be granted statehood if they gave up the Toledo Strip, and in addition, they would also receive the Upper Peninsula. Michigan refused at first due to the perceived lack of resources in the Upper Peninsula, but by the end of that year, Michigan was nearly bankrupt. And with the government only willing to give Michigan a part of the $400,000 surplus that they became a state, they accepted. But while Michigan didn't get what they set out to in this war, the Upper Peninsula ended up being incredibly valuable when copper was discovered in the Upper Peninsula, leading to a mining boom and being a huge addition to the state. But while both states weren't heavily harmed by the result, disputes didn't end. Constant debates ensued in the following decades, and the border would not be officially mapped until 1915, when Woodrow Wilson ordered the border to be surveyed. The governors of Michigan and Ohio shook hands at the border, and a plaque was unveiled with a Robert Frost quote that read, "Good fences make good neighbors." And while the border was finally mapped, the Michigan and Ohio State football rivalry was already decades into its long history. When Michigan and Ohio State met for the first time in 1897, for many, the Toledo War was still fresh in their mind. And if there was any animosity from the results of the war, then Michigan got revenge in the first game by winning 34-0. But when you consider that Michigan's program had existed for 11 years longer than Ohio's to that point, it's not surprising. And that first game was a sign of things to come, as Michigan would go on to win 19 of the first 24 meetings, including an 86-0 win in their third game. Ohio State won 3 times, and the two would tie twice in this period, with Michigan claiming 6 national titles. So to this point, the border disputes were more compelling than this rivalry. While Ohio State did have a 3-year streak from 1919 to 1921, they didn't prove themselves to be in the same national regard as Michigan until the hiring of Francis Schmidt in 1934. When asked how he would beat Michigan in his interview, he said, "Of course we can win. Michigan puts on their pants one leg at a time just like we do." And Schmidt proved that right away, as in the first 4 years of his tenure, they all resulted in victories over Michigan with a combined score of 114-0. And with that comment, and his first victory over Michigan in 1934, it sparked a tradition of Ohio State players receiving gold pants pendants after victories over Michigan. While the end of Schmidt's 7-year run wasn't ideal, this period proved that Ohio State belonged in elite status, and the game was no longer a one-sided affair. But while there was a brief time of domination for Ohio State, Michigan still dominated the end of the 30s and all of the 40s, losing just twice in a 12-year span. And by the midway point of the century, Michigan had a record of 31, 12, and 4, which includes the final game of the half-century in one of college football's most famous games, called the Snowball. On November 25th, the two were scheduled to meet in Columbus, and on that day, one of the worst blizzards in Ohio history hit. An impact of the Great Appalachian Storm, Ohio was covered in a foot of snow, with snow drifts reaching as high as 25 feet. And with Ohio State leading the Big Ten, they had the option to cancel the game and guarantee a Big Ten championship. But they refused. And if that fact alone wasn't enough to show how much this game meant, an additional 50,000 showed up to watch this catastrophe of a game. If you want to know why it was a catastrophe, the simple fact that there were 45 punts in this game may tell you. Both teams continued to punt, even on first downs. With the blinding snow-covered field, all they could hope for is for someone to make a mistake. And it happened when Michigan recovered a block punt for a touchdown before halftime, which would be the only touchdown of the game, as Michigan won 9-3 despite not recording one first down. But perhaps the biggest thing to come out of this game was the resignation of Wes Fessler, as their next hiring in Woody Hayes would change the history of the program and the history of the game. Hayes differed immensely in style from Fessler, implementing demanding practice regimen with aggressive and loud enforcement, much different from Fessler's laid-back style. And after a rough first year, including a loss to Michigan, fans questioned his ability. And after starting 1-2 against Michigan, the questioning led to a desire for replacement. But then, the year 1954 happened. In a year with low expectations, Ohio State went into the game against Michigan undefeated, and they left undefeated, as they went on to win the shared national championship. And after this game, Ohio State had their first extended era of dominance over Michigan, winning 10 of the next 14, including the 1968 game where Ohio State had their biggest victory over Michigan, winning 50-14. And late into the game, to rub it in even more, Ohio State went for 2. When asked why they went for 2, Woody Hayes said because he couldn't go for 3. But like the preceding events of the Snowball, the events following this game changed the rivalry and gave it its greatest era. Prior to the start of 1969, Michigan hired Bo Schembechler as their coach. But what makes this saga seem like a scripted story is that Schembechler coached under Woody Hayes at Miami of Ohio and at Ohio State. But while that gave Bo a slight advantage, it didn't seem anything could give Michigan an advantage going into the game against Ohio State. Ohio State had won 22 games in a row and had been called by some the greatest college football team of all time. They went into Ann Arbor as 17-point favorites, and the favorite Ohio State scored first, but Michigan responded with a touchdown of their own. The two exchanged touchdowns again, and for the first time all season, Ohio State trailed at the half, and that 24-12 score would hold, as no points were scored in the second half. And Michigan completed what is considered one of the greatest upsets in college football history. But what this game was notable for was the start of what became known as the 10-year war. During this period, we saw perhaps the peak of this great rivalry, and took it from an intense regional rivalry to a national spectacle that is simply called the game. This 10-year war sparked an intense, almost psychopathic feud between Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler. Hayes was paranoid that Bo was doing anything to gain an advantage, such as bringing police to practices to make sure he wasn't spying, and accusing Bo of distracting their team with beautiful waitresses at restaurants. And in this period, Hayes coined the term, "that team up north," simply because he refused to say Michigan. From 1970 to 1975, these two went into the game in the top 5 of the AP poll 4 times. And in all those years, Michigan went into the game undefeated, and only ended up winning one of these games in 1971. But the most memorable of those games happened in 1973. Ohio State came out of the tunnel and tore down the M Club banner Michigan usually runs under. But after this, neither offense impressed, and after 2 missed field goals, the game ended in a 10-10 tie. Despite this, Michigan appeared to play better than Ohio State, and in reference to going to the Rose Bowl, Woody Hayes said Michigan deserved to go. But in this time, who went to the Rose Bowl had to be decided by a vote of the Big Ten team's athletic directors. And even with a tie, Michigan would be given the berth. but the vote was 6-4 in Ohio State's favor, with Illinois voting for Ohio State despite telling Schembechler they would vote for Michigan prior, and the rumors that Michigan State had the deciding vote, and shocker, they didn't vote for Michigan. Naturally, everyone on Michigan's side was furious. Schembechler blamed the decision on petty jealousies, and some speculate that with the Big Ten losing the prior 4 Rose Bowls and Michigan's quarterback Dennis Franklin getting injured, perhaps they were worried. But regardless, I think everyone now feels that it was pretty ridiculous to decide who went to the Rose Bowl based on a vote amongst athletic directors. But either way, it worked out in the Big Ten's favor after Ohio State won the Rose Bowl by 21 against USC, only adding fuel to the fire of this rivalry. And after the period of Ohio State winning almost all the top 5 matchups, the final 3 matchups in the 10-year war went in Michigan's favor, giving them a 5-4-1 advantage in the 10-year war. And the reason the war lasted 10 years and none longer is an unfortunate one. After the 1978 game, Ohio State went up against Clemson in the Gator Bowl, with Clemson up by 2 with 2.5 minutes left. Ohio State threw an interception to Charlie Bowman near the sideline where he ran out of bounds. Then after getting up, Woody Hayes punched Bowman in the neck, sparking a bench-clearing brawl. After the game, Ohio State's athletic director and one of Hayes' former players, Hugh Hindman, got into a heated exchange with Hayes and implied that this would be Hayes' final game as a coach. Giving him a chance to resign, he said that would be too easy for them, and it would be better if they fired him. And so, they did, putting an end to the tenure of arguably the most influential coach in college football history, and officially ending the 10-year war. What followed the 10-year war was a period not seen in the rivalry before, and that's a balanced stretch. With Earl Bruce as Ohio State coach from 1979 to 1987, neither team won more than 2 consecutive games. Michigan had a chance for their only 3-game win streak in Bruce's final game, and despite being favored and Bruce being fired prior to the game, Ohio State would win. But then, this brought in the era of John Cooper for the Buckeyes. If there's any proof of how important the game is, then look at how John Cooper is remembered amongst the Buckeye fanbase. Cooper came in amidst a rebuild, and from 1988 to 2000, his first was his only losing season, and his tenure brought 111 wins, 3 Big Ten championships, and a Heisman Trophy. But in 13 games against Michigan, he only won twice, giving us a one-sided period we saw many times throughout this rivalry. Cooper would be fired after a 6-6 season in 2000, and it's not fair to say he did a bad job at Ohio State. But ultimately, 10 years at Michigan and Ohio State are judged on how they do in the game, and Cooper treated the game as if it was just that, a game. As seen throughout, if there's one thing that can bring a shift in the rivalry, it's a coaching change. And the turn of the century brought in Jim Tressel. He promised to beat Michigan during a halftime speech at an Ohio State basketball game, and delivered in his first year, giving Ohio State their first victory in Ann Arbor in 14 years, and his second year brought a national championship. And moving to his 6th year, with a record of 4-1 against Michigan, both him and the Lloyd Carr-led Wolverines went into the game undefeated, with both in the top 2 of the BCS rankings, setting up for the game of the century. In one of the most watched regular season college football games of all time, Ohio State held a 14-point lead at the half after 21 unanswered points. But Michigan cut the lead to 4 in the 4th. But after a huge roughing the passer call, Ohio State scored. Michigan would score again, but could not recover the onside kick, giving Ohio State the win and a national championship berth. The following year opened with one of the biggest upsets in college football history, when Appalachian State beat Michigan in the Big House, and this seemed to be the start of a dark era for Michigan. After the 2019 game, Michigan had only beat Ohio State twice since 2001, with 0 Big Ten championships, and in that time, Michigan went through a number of coaches, including the end of Lloyd Carr's career, Rich Rodriguez, Brady Hoke, and of course, Jim Harbaugh. Meanwhile, Ohio State also went through a number of coaches. The Tressel era ended the same way the Hayes era did, in scandal, after Tressel did not disclose information that players had received improper benefits, notably exchanging autographs for tattoos. Tressel resigned with all their 2010 wins being vacated. Michigan picked up their only win against Ohio State from 2001 to 2019 during Luke Fickell's 1 year. But then, Urban Meyer became coach and didn't lose against Michigan during his 7-year tenure. Ryan Day took over as coach in 2019, and his victory in his first year made Jim Harbaugh the first coach to ever lose the first 5 meetings between the two. And it remained at 5 after the game was canceled for the first time since 1917 and 2020. due to COVID-19 cases within Michigan, something Ohio State fans had their theories about. But regardless, the following year marked the 12th time the two met as top 5 seeds. And after 5 Hassan Haskins touchdowns, for the first time in a decade and for the first time under Harbaugh, Michigan picked up a win over Ohio State. And the following year, once again, the two met as top 5 seeds. And once again, Michigan picked up the win, this being their first in Ohio in 22 years. And of course, this brings us to the present day. And for the 3rd year in a row, these two will meet as top 5 seeds. And for the 2nd year in a row, they will both go in undefeated, times that are reminiscent of the 10-year war. But in this year's matchup, there's an underlying story that makes it one of the most compelling games. And that's the sign-stealing scandal that seems to grow in story with every passing day. Jim Harbaugh will not be on the sidelines on Saturday after receiving and accepting a 3-game suspension that began the day before Michigan's game against Penn State. And no matter what happens, it will be a game that affects the game and college football for years to come. There's no telling what will happen in the wake of the sign-stealing scandal, but it's fair to say that it's probably not completely over. And for Ryan Day and Ohio State, it may be surprising on paper, but you have to wonder if his future with Ohio State is on the line. If you want even further proof of how much this game means, Ryan Day has compiled a record of 52-6, and yet is still on the hot seat because of a 1-2 record against Michigan. And it doesn't help that Day already has more losses against Michigan than Meyer and Tressel combined. And after this year, Big Ten and college football won't be the same with the new conference alignments. The Big Ten will now have teams on the West Coast, and the college football playoffs will expand. And there's no doubt that Michigan and Ohio State will have much tougher schedules next year than they've had in previous years. So it's interesting to wonder if this year's game will mark the end of a short-lived era between Day and Harbaugh, with national championship implications on the line almost every year. One or possibly both of these two coaches could be gone by next year, and the game may not basically be the Big Ten championship like it had been the past few years. But no matter what happens, these two teams and fan bases will continue to hate each other. And this level of competitiveness and hatefulness was paved by centuries of conflict both on and off the field. Through the Toledo War to the 10-year war, Michigan and Ohio State became much more than a game and became the game, respected and known worldwide.